Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ryan Crocker, a diplomat in residence here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and former colleague, Bill Burns. All of you know who he is and what he's done. I would simply say two things. First, only the second Foreign Service officer in history to rise to the position of Deputy Secretary of State. The other was Larry Eagleburger. Second, we're from the same smallish tribe, the Near East Bureau of the State Department. And I had the pleasure of working for him then when he was Assistant Secretary. Those were some pretty hard times. Perspective is important as you look at the current time. But as I was fond of remarking, anywhere but Washington, at least I had the luxury of being able to get to places like Baghdad and Kabul. You had to do the hard fighting in the trenches. Let's give Bill Burns a welcome.
Very much, Ryan. I really am delighted to be with all of you this afternoon. It is a genuine honor to be introduced by Ryan Crocker, who's always embodied for me the very best of our profession of American diplomacy. I'm delighted to be back in Princeton. I'm the proud father of a graduate of the class of 2014 and the proud son of a mid-career MPA class of 1969. So I guess you could say that in the family gene pool, the shallow part is in the middle. I'm delighted, I have to admit, as Ryan was suggesting before, to escape Washington, D.C. for a few days. It's still a city, as you can see from this safe distance, characterized by dysfunction and self-absorption. The only place, as former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates used to put it, where you can see someone walking down Lover's Lane holding his own hand. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to offer a few observations on American foreign policy on what is today a very turbulent landscape, and against the backdrop of Washington in the age of Donald Trump, which has its own turbulence these days. I'm a recovering diplomat. Recovering diplomats have a very well-deserved reputation for being long-winded. I will do my best to break that stereotype this afternoon. Whenever I think of the value of brevity in public speaking, I'm reminded of a story that involved the famous author George Bernard Shaw. It seems that Shaw was hosting an event in London one day, and the first speaker came up to him and asked how long he should speak for. And Shaw told him he should probably limit his remarks to about 40 minutes. The speaker looked at him in horror and said, 40 minutes? How am I supposed to tell them everything I know in 40 minutes? Shaw paused and replied, in your case, my advice would be to speak very slowly. In my case, you don't have to worry about me going beyond 40 minutes, even if I speak very slowly. What I'll try to do simply is offer a few observations on what makes this moment, at least in my view, on the international landscape distinct. And on three particularly important regional challenges: Asia and the rise of China, Europe and the resurgence of Russia, and then the Middle East and all of its dysfunctions. So first, what makes this moment distinctive? It seems to me it's the intersection of two really important phenomena. The first is the fragmentation of power on the international landscape today, and a whole set of profound transformations, alongside increasing uncertainty about the role of the United States in the world. The United States, the principal shaper for the last 7 decades and principal preserver of international order. Either of those phenomenon on their own would be a major challenge, but taken together, it seems to me, they pose the kind of profound challenge to international order that you see once or twice a century. Now, as a diplomat, I served through 3 fairly distinct eras in the international system: the bipolar moment to the Cold War, the so-called unipolar moment for the first 15 or 20 years after the end of the Cold War, in which America was dominant in the international system, That's a moment whose end we accelerated by the mistakes we made in Iraq in 2003 and a different kind of hubris in the great financial crisis in 2008. But we've clearly entered in recent years into a new era whose contours I don't think are really fixed yet, marked by the rise of new global powers of China and India, the resurgence of Russia, some serious challenges to regional order most vividly and most violently in the Middle East, a set of global transformations, climate change, for example, with the real challenge and risk that poses to international society, and then the revolution in technology. Rapid advances, breathtaking advances in cyber issues, machine learning, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, which are transforming not just the way societies function and economies work, but the interaction between governments as well. So it seems to me that against the backdrop of those changes and the collisions amongst them, the United States is no longer the dominant player in the international system that we once were, but I would argue we're still the preeminent player in the international system. And I say that not as a statement of American arrogance, but if you look objectively at the enduring strengths of the United States, not just our military, we still spend as much every year as the next 7 countries combined. The innovativeness and resilience of our economy, energy is a source of strength, with technology unlocking vast new resources in natural gas and the potential of clean energy technology increasing. Demography, if we can ever get immigration reform right, makes us a relatively younger and more mobile population than our peer competitors. Geography, our 2 liquid assets, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which insulate us from the kind of threats that most other major powers are more vulnerable to. And also, I would argue, diplomacy. Our capacity, unrivaled in the world today, to build coalitions, to draw on alliances, to cement partnerships, which sets us apart from lonelier powers like Russia and China. And so in a sense, if you think about what sets the United States apart today, that gives us a window as we look out over the next 2 or 3 decades within which we can help shape an adapted international order before it gets shaped for us by the rise of other forces and other powers. What's worked for us in the past has been a commitment to enlightened self-interest, when at our best we've been able to see our interests as broadened by deepening the stake of other countries in the kind of open trading arrangements, open political systems, regional order that benefits not just us, but benefits other countries as well. What I fear we're seeing today, especially over the year plus of the Trump administration, is much more emphasis on the self part of that equation than on the enlightened part. It's been a kind of nasty brew of unilateralism, of nativism, of mercantilism, flavored by the president's personal blend of narcissism and impulsiveness. And it seems to me that carries with it some pretty significant risks. Some of them we've seen already, the kind of reckless detachment of the United States on the international stage, pulling out of the Paris Climate Treaty, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big new trade agreement, which would have knit together 40% of the global economy around high-end trade and investment standards, the continuing threats to the North America Free Trade Agreement, as well as the Iran nuclear agreement. But beyond those issues on the surface, it seems to me there's a lot to worry about beneath the waterline as well. In terms of the American idea and what it represents in the world, I've always thought that the power of our example matters a lot more than the power of our preaching. And the example that we're transmitting to the world right now, I fear, is that of a society which has a hard time governing itself, which can't yet come to grips with problems of guns in our own society, which can't yet come to grips with the huge opportunity of immigration, which is having a huge challenge in trying to deal with the inequalities that afflict our society as well. And so against that backdrop, against that huge set of challenges, the United States faces another set of issues. It's not just the American idea and the influence that comes with that in the world. It's also the sense of American initiative, which, as I said before, sets us apart, our capacity for mobilizing partners and alliances. And last but not least, it's the erosion of the institutions of national security in the United States. And I'll mention, just as an example, the State Department, our old institution, which really is in the process of being dismantled today. And I don't exaggerate when I say that. It's a State Department that faces for the second year in a row a roughly 30% budget cut. 30% of our embassies today don't have ambassadors, including insignificant places like Seoul in South Korea today. We have 6 regional bureaus in the State Department, which is how the institution sort of organizes itself. Only one of those 6 have a confirmed assistant secretary confirmed by the US Senate. There's only 1 out of 6 undersecretary positions that's filled today. Of the career ambassadors, the highest personal rank in the Foreign Service, there's only 1 of 6 remaining, and that person is sitting at Georgetown University, blacklisted from, potential jobs in this administration. Intake into the Foreign Service has been cut by 75% over the course of this past year. And not surprisingly, you have a 50% drop in the number of young people applying to enter the Foreign Service as well. So it amounts to a kind of unilateral diplomatic disarmament, which does significant long-term damage. So that's the backdrop, hardly uplifting, against which I'll look at a couple of important places on the international landscape. I know I'm going to repeat the mistake that American policymakers like me have made for many years and not focus as much as I should on either Africa or our own hemisphere. That is an enduring mistake. Population of Africa is likely to double by the middle of this century from 1 billion to 2 billion, which creates enormous possibilities, but also enormous challenges. If you assume that the unresolved regional conflicts, problems of food, water, and health insecurity, of corruption, of poor governance continue as well. In our own hemisphere, which ought to be the natural strategic home base of the United States, often suffers from not so benign neglect, I think particularly in this administration. But what I'll try to focus on, as I mentioned before, are 3 other regions and challenges to order in the world. And the first of those is Asia and the rise of China. The rise of China, as all of you know as well as I do, is the single most consequential phenomenon in international order as far out as I can see into the 21st century. And it's the biggest single test for American statecraft in that period as well. It's part of a wider phenomenon of the shifting of the center of gravity in the international system from west to east. Within the next decade or so, the 4 biggest economic powers in the world will all be Pacific powers: China, the United States, India, and Japan. History's full, as you know, of collisions between rising powers like China and established powers like the United States. If we're honest with ourselves, there is that possibility in US-China relations over the coming years. I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's foreordained. But I also don't underestimate the ambition of Xi Jinping with the talk of removing term limits for Chinese presidents. It's clear that his ambitions are pretty powerful as you look at over the next few years. For many in the Chinese elite, as a number of you in this room know far better than I do, the natural order of things is for China to be the dominant player in Asia. And if anyone thinks that the One Belt, One Road initiative, which bears Xi Jinping's leadership, is just about infrastructure in across Eurasia, then, I think they're underestimating the ambitions of this Chinese leadership. It's a long-term strategy, naturally in some respects, to anchor Chinese influence outside Asia and across the Eurasian landmass as well. It's not like the United States doesn't have assets in dealing with the challenge of helping to manage China's rise. There are lots of players across Asia which have their own anxieties about China's purpose and its ambitions, from India, with whom we built a strong partnership over the course of the last 3 US administrations of both parties, through new partners in Southeast Asia to our traditional treaty allies in Japan and in South Korea. But again, we're in the process of disarming ourselves by abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have created a model for economic interchange in Asia, and it's a vacuum that the Chinese are busily going to fill in our absence. I think the single biggest test in US-China relations as you look out over the next year or 2 is obviously going to be North Korea. Kim Jong-un is very close to the finish line in terms of his ambition to establish the capacity to fire an ICBM, a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear warhead on top, and hit the continental United States. It's going to be very difficult, it seems to me at least, to curb that ambition in the short run. It's hard for me to see how negotiations, however laudable the effort may be, are going to produce a denuclearized North Korea anytime soon. In part because I think from the perspective of the Chinese leadership, the honest answer is that the risk of an imploding North Korea, brought about as a result of a very tight economic squeeze, is greater than the risk of North Korea that has that capacity that I described before. And therefore, I think the options for the United States, honestly, again, are pretty limited. People talk about military options. They're easier to talk about unless you take into account the interests of the 20 million people in Greater Seoul who are within 30 or 35 miles of huge numbers of long-range North Korean artillery pieces and missiles and the potential to use chemical and biological weapons. So I suspect that where we're going to wind up in a classic diplomatic fashion is going to be with the challenge of containing and deterring North Korea. North Korea that has established this capacity. That's not an impossible task, even if it's a pretty unappealing one. And alongside it will come the challenge of how do you prevent North Korea from proliferating the weapons that it's developed? And that's going to be a classic diplomatic challenge. How do you mobilize other countries to take on that huge test? So let me turn now to Europe. I think, by almost any calculation, Europe faces the toughest set of challenges to its order of any time since the end of the Cold War, certainly. Some of them are internal, Brexit, a largely self-inflicted wound, in my opinion, but which has called into question some of the broader sense of purposes of the European Union. And a lot of them are external. Almost any place you look on the geopolitical compass, to the west, uncertainty about the transatlantic connection, given a lot of the early rhetoric, at least, to President Trump. To the south, across the Mediterranean, the insecurity, instability, migration flows, potential for extremist violence that comes out of instability in the Middle East. And then to the east, the challenge of a resurgent Russia, of Putin's Russia. I served in Russia twice during the course of my checkered career, and it was a long lesson, continues to be a long lesson in humility. But I do think it's a safe bet that Vladimir Putin is going to be reelected president of Russia next month. I also think it's a safe bet that relations between the United States and Russia are going to be largely adversarial over the course of Putin's tenure. Putin is likely to remain a very combustible combination of grievance and insecurity and ambition. When he became president in 2000, he set out to restore the power of the state in Russia after a period in the 1990s when I first served in Russia, in Boris Yeltsin's Russia, where Russians were flat on their back economically and felt a sense of both political chaos at home and impotence abroad. And Putin also has wanted to reestablish Russia's place at the table of great powers in the world. He knows he's playing a relatively weak hand. It's a one-dimensional economy, still way too dependent on hydrocarbons. He faces demographic challenges, which aren't an academic problem if you're one of the roughly 30 million Russians living in the huge swath of the earth that runs from the Ural Mountains across Siberia and the Russian Far East to the Pacific, looking across a very long border at 1.3 billion Chinese and sitting on just about everything in the periodic table of elements. So there's a reason that Russians can feel insecure and feel vulnerable. But what Putin has said about doing with that weak hand is to play it with a fair amount of tactical agility, especially in recent years, and a willingness to play rough, too. He set about trying to chip away at an American-led international order because it's his conviction, shared to some extent by the Chinese leadership and other aspiring regional powers, that that's the best way to create space for themselves as a great power for their own ambitions in the world. And it's been convenient for him to be able to point to enemies at the gate, to justify political repression at home by pointing to threats from the United States in particular. that also happens to be, at least in my experience with them, an article of conviction too. It's not just contrived. I remember one time when I was ambassador, I think it was early 2008, and Putin was reasonably accessible in that period, but usually when you saw him, there was a buildup of several days. I mean, he's not a real spontaneous person, but I remember getting a call one day in my office in the embassy, could I come see him that afternoon? And I figured my dance card was pretty open, and so sure. And I went out to see him, not in the Kremlin, because he was out as his dacha complex in the forest outside Moscow. And I got out there expecting to wait for an hour or two, because that's usually his modus operandi. I remember with people much more senior than me, Condi Rice when she was secretary, and Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense, him quite consciously keeping them waiting for an hour or two before a meeting just to show who was setting the agenda. But this time I was ushered straight in to see him. He's never big on small talk, but the first words out of his mouth were, "Don't think we don't know what you're doing." And I figured, well, boy, there's a rapid end to my tenure as the American ambassador in Russia, but it was actually connecting the dots amongst a very modest set of assistance programs we were running for civil society groups in Russia, mostly environmental groups, one group which promoted the interests of the disabled in Russia. What seemed the kind of things that the United States does in lots of different parts of the world. But for Putin, connecting the dots from the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 all the way to the present, this was all about a conspiracy on the part of the United States to keep Russia down, to keep it in its place. And however much, I said to him at the time, he gave us way more credit than we deserved for careful conspiracies. But that became an article of conviction with him as well. And so in a sense, what you've seen in recent years, in his mind, has been settling scores and getting even. And he's tended to see a kind of target-rich environment around him. So in Ukraine in 2014, he didn't anticipate, I don't think, that former President Yanukovych was going to flee the battlefield. He always thought he was a weakling anyway, and that the way to have stopped the demonstrations in the Maidan in Kyiv would have been to kill several dozen demonstrators. But he reacted in the only way he knew how, Putin, by annexing Crimea, and then by trying to foment as much instability as he could in southeastern Ukraine on the theory that if you can't have your first preference, which is a deferential government in Kyiv, the next best thing is a dysfunctional Ukraine. In Syria in 2015, and Ryan knows this far better than I do, but Putin saw an opening. In a situation in which I think the United States had unfortunately detached itself in some ways from the role that we might have played. And he turned a relatively modest military deployment, 36 attack aircraft and several thousand military personnel, into a huge political and diplomatic splash. And then in our own elections in 2016, the next year, I think Putin's purpose was to sow chaos in the American political system. It was tactical. I mean, it was an opportunity to, in his eyes, expose the hypocrisy of the American system and its corruption. I don't think he imagined in his wildest dreams that he would have sowed as much disarray as he did. I think he imagined in his wildest dreams that Donald Trump was actually going to get elected president. He was seeking to hobble Hillary Clinton, whom he assumed was going to be president, and try to weaken her as much as he could as she came into office. So, I'm sorry, I'm not being very uplifting about Russia. So let me turn to the Middle East, where I really won't be uplifting. And I'm sitting in the presence of, Salam Fayyad, the former prime minister of Palestine, who's as fine a leader as I ever have known in the Arab world. But I must say that I think, pessimism is usually the best default position in the Middle East, because pessimists, rarely lack for company or validation. Pessimists are hardly ever wrong in the Middle East. And I think the dysfunctions that we've seen bubbling up, certainly since the Arab Spring in 2011, are going to be with us for some decades to come in most Arab societies. There's a vacuum that's been created as a result of those revolts in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, with a big question mark hanging over it. What comes next? There's no shortage of people with their own answers to that question, from Sunni extremist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or whatever acronym comes next, predatory regional powers like Iran, who will continue to try to take advantage of that, or Sunni Arab authoritarian regimes who are trying to recover their grip on power. The United States, our role is not to solve all those problems. Hubris created huge problems for us and accelerated the problems of the region in 2003 in Iraq. But there is also a role for the United States to play in trying to temper the worst impulses of that region within the bounds, in a kind of disciplined way, within the bounds of our resources and our ability to influence. And I think, we've learned in some ways in Syria in recent years, and even in Libya after the overthrow of Gaddafi, that underreach in terms of American policy can also create problems as well. As I look ahead, I'm worried by a number of dimensions of the kind of Middle East policy problem. And I'm the first to admit that my generation didn't bring a lot of successes across the Middle East either. But I'm worried by Syria, not just the horrific human consequences of what we're seeing there, but especially, I saw Secretary Tillerson's speech in Stanford, I guess about 6 weeks ago, which laid out a perfectly reasonable set of objectives about ISIS and about political transition beyond Bashar al-Assad. But it leaves a huge gap between ends and means, and that's what gets us in trouble in the Middle East sometimes, because if anyone thinks that the Russians, the Iranians, the Assad regime, all pretty unsentimental players, are going to have their minds focused by 1,500 US Special Operations Forces in eastern Syria, I really have my doubts as well. I have deep worries about the state of the Palestinian-Israeli issue, and again, Salam and Dan Kurtzer know this issue infinitely better than I ever will. But I think it's incredibly short-sighted of the United States, as the two-state solution expires, to think that somehow this isn't going to matter so much in the future. I think it's a disservice to Palestinians, to their legitimate aspirations. It's a disservice to neighboring countries like Jordan, who are going to be deeply exposed in the absence of a two-state solution. And it's a deep disservice to Israelis, because it's hard for me to see how Israel's long-term security, the long-term health of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, can be sustained when, in the land from the Jordan River across to the Mediterranean, Arabs are demographically the majority part of the population. And how do you preserve that kind of democratic system in that kind of a circumstance? I also worry about relations with some of our closest Arab partners, particularly in the Gulf right now. I admire what Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia is trying to do in terms of social and economic modernization at home, but I worry about the problem of overreach, whether it's in terms of political consolidation or overreach in the region, in Yemen in particular, which is a catastrophic ongoing conflict right now. I worry that, in some respects, we're too indulgent in terms of American policy, and that we don't try to ensure more of a two-way street in those relationships, where we offer the kind of reassurance that we ought to offer in terms of potential external threats from Iran or anyone else. We provide full-throated support for social and economic modernization, but we're also honest about problems of overreach in Yemen, as I mentioned, and elsewhere, and in Lebanon, where I think what the Saudi leadership tried to do recently with the kind of temporary detention of the prime minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri, was another evidence of kind of a willingness to fight to the last Lebanese, which doesn't do any favors for stability in Lebanon either. I worry about a lack of focus on the deeper drivers of change in the Middle East, because the Arab Spring is going to recur again if that same sense of indignity is not addressed in a lot of Arab societies. It's not like Americans have the perfect formula for addressing those issues. We don't. But it's important to keep those issues in focus. And last but not least, there's Iran and the whole dilemma of the nuclear agreement and what President Trump is going to do in May when he next faces the question of whether or not to extend waivers on sanctions again. I'm not objective on this issue. I worked hard in the negotiations with the Iranians. I led the secret talks with the Iranians through almost all of 2013, which produced the interim nuclear agreement. The thing that surprised me most, to be honest, is we kept it quiet as long as we did in this day and age, in 2013. I would be the first to admit it's not a perfect agreement. I've yet to meet the perfect diplomatic agreement. But I think it serves its purpose, which is to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. It does not solve the wider problem of Iran. It has to be embedded in a wider strategy to work with our friends to push back against Iranian behavior, which threatens our interests and threatens their interests in the Middle East. But I really fear that we're going to end up with the worst of both worlds. That if the president decides to walk away from the agreement in a couple of months, we'll walk away alone. There'll be a big rift between us and our closest European partners who helped us negotiate and bring about the agreement. We'll, in a sense, be doing Vladimir Putin's work for him. Iran will be unconstrained and could at least potentially restart its nuclear program, will be without the capacity to remobilize the sanctions and the international pressure that took so many years to build in the first place. And I fail to see how walking away from the Iranian nuclear agreement puts us in a better position to try to negotiate a nuclear agreement with North Korea. Other than that, I think it's a great idea. So I think that's a huge challenge. So now I know I am dangerously close to the George Bernard Shaw rule for brevity in public speaking. So I'll end actually on a more optimistic note. I'm a big believer in the resilience of our own society and in some ways in the resilience of the international system. You know, for all the challenges and the troubles I've been describing, there's some profoundly encouraging trend lines out there too. Hundreds of millions of people in recent years who have been raised out of poverty and into the middle class in countries like China and India and large parts of Africa. Huge progress in terms of human health and life expectancy. I'm an optimist that we'll find a way to maximize the benefits of the revolution in technology and mitigate or minimize its dislocations. But I do worry as we look ahead over the next couple years, because we're still in a pretty significant hole. And one of our former bosses in the State Department, one of my predecessors as deputy secretary, a guy named Rich Armitage, used to remind me when I talked about the hole we're in of the first law of holes. When you're in one and you want to get out, the first thing you should do is stop digging. I'm not sure if we're done digging yet. And I'm worried about 2018 because almost any transition to a new administration I've seen over recent decades, you inevitably in your first year run into some international crisis, whether it's self-inflicted or it just happens. And in a sense, all of us have been lucky, this administration has been fortunate not to face that kind of crisis in its first year, but I fear that it's coming in 2018. Could be North Korea, could be Iran, could be parts of the world we don't spend a lot of time focused on, like Pakistan and India. Ryan, as a former ambassador to Pakistan, knows very well that if you had another terrorist attack from Pakistani soil, a third the size of the Mumbai attack in November 2008, you'd be off to the races. I'm not sure the current Indian prime minister would turn the other cheek. And I think there would be huge burden on the United States to kick into gear diplomatically to try to de-escalate tensions. At a moment when we're in the process of hollowing out diplomacy as an instrument and the State Department as an institution, that becomes harder and harder to do. But more broadly, beyond the next year or two and those potential crises, I'm worried a little bit about what happens when we finally stop digging. Because what I fear is that we're going to climb up to the ground level and look out over a landscape that's hardened against our interests and our values, because other players are going to fill the vacuums that we're creating today. And it's going to create a circumstance that can do not just corrosive, but permanent damage, not just to the United States' role in the world, but to the prospects for the kind of international order that, of course, has to be adapted to fit the world of 2018. But a world that, I think the United States still has a lot to contribute to. So the sooner we stop digging, the better. Thank you.
Well done. Okay, we've got some time for questions. 2 mics, one there, and priority to students.
Hi, thank you for coming today. I had a question about how the U.S. should manage its relations with countries that offer this kind of two-pronged problem. Turkey is the one that comes to mind, right? I mean, we're allies technically with Turkey, but it's kind of hard to overlook what Erdogan is doing domestically, what he's doing in terms of attacking the Kurds, who are our allies as well, how he's threatening to go to Russia unless we turn the other way, and the same thing with Pakistan. Pakistan, we just put them on a terror financing watch list. I'm wondering how, as a diplomat, you try and balance the issues of we need them in our camp because they can't go the other way, but at the same time they're doing all these horrible things that if it were some other country we would speak out about.
Yeah, but you're keeping my nostalgia for government service under control, because those are amongst the most confounding challenges you face as a diplomat. And I wish I could suggest that we always got it right. I certainly didn't. The balance between pushing societies and leaderships to address some of those challenges, not as a favor to the United States, but in their own self-interest, because history tells you that societies that don't address some of those problems of whether it's repressive political systems or creating more economic opportunities, they become brittle and break, and they become much less reliable allies and partners for the United States. But there's all sorts of short-term realities that you have to deal with, whether it's counterterrorism cooperation or access to the American military or bases. We faced this for years. Dan knows this as a former ambassador to Egypt as well, in dealing with Mubarak's Egypt as well, and trying to find the right balance between being direct, oftentimes in private, but sometimes in public, about human rights abuses and concerns, and yet still preserving, some of those other interests. So I don't have a magic formula. I do believe it's a huge mistake for us to go mute on that set of human rights issues, which is what I fear we're doing today, or being totally selective about them. In other words, going after full-throated, human rights abuses in Iran or in North Korea, which we ought to do, but then giving lots of other people a pass. And I just think that erodes America's influence in the world. It's not what people expect of us. I know there are limits to the power of our preaching. People don't like being lectured to, so a lot of this has to do with the tone and the style with which you do it. But the one thing I'm convinced of is it's a huge mistake to punt entirely on those issues. And I'm quite worried about the direction of Erdogan's Turkey. I think it's a society whose political system is getting more and more constricted. And that's going to create even bigger problems, not just for allies like the United States, but for Turkey itself over the coming years. Pakistan, I wish I had better solutions too, because I felt that same sense of frustration which seems to have impelled the administration to suspend assistance and do other things. When you see behavior in support of the Haqqanis or other terrorist groups which are killing Americans in Afghanistan, that's impossible to swallow. On the other hand, there are huge challenges in sort of cutting off conversations with the country as well. Hi.
My name is Jessie Durrett. I'm a current MPA student here in my first year, and I have two questions if you have the time.
Sure.
Number
Just
one
like
is...
a State Department press conference.
Number one, what advice would you give to the current State Department policymakers working on Russia, and for that matter, military as well, and including the current ambassador? Mm-hmm. And the second question is more related to your current role as the head of the Carnegie Institute, and how, given the times where I assume you have less welcome ears in halls of power, how you're thinking about the role of the think tank, the role of the think tank in contributing to a policy dialogue that may or may not welcome its presence and thoughts.
They're both really good questions. I think on Russia, first, John Huntsman, who's our current ambassador in Moscow, is a really fine diplomat and doesn't need my advice. I think the reality is that, the first point is you got to be realistic. I think relations within Russia, between the United States and Russia are going to happen within a relatively narrow band, over the course of at least Putin's tenure as president. So you don't want to get your hopes up too high, as occasionally we've done in the past, thinking that some form of partnership is possible. On the other hand, you don't want to let them get so low that you miss those areas where cold-bloodedly we need to figure out a way to work together. Even in the worst of the Ukraine crisis, for example, we were still working reasonably well with Russia on the Iranian nuclear negotiations. So, they're pretty sentimental about this. They're capable of compartmentalizing to some extent. We should be too. But we just have to understand that I think that band within which we manage a largely adversarial relationship, and I think that's the right verb, manage, is going to be a relatively narrow one. And I say that without any great enthusiasm because, you know, I have great respect for Russia as a society and for Russians, and I think it's, you know, there's huge potential as you look at over the next few decades. And there may come a moment beyond Putin where the rise of China, you know, the One Belt, One Road expands Chinese influence into Central Asia, which Russians continue to see as their backyard, deepens the interest of Russians in a healthier, whatever Russian leadership is in place then, in a healthier relationship with Europe and the United States. So we have to, it seems to me, play a sort of long game in thinking about Russia. On the issue of Carnegie, I mean, an institution I'm really proud to lead right now, and it's really nice to see Shirley Tillman, a former president of Princeton and also former vice chair of the Carnegie Endowment board here. I actually think the role of institutions like Carnegie is even more important in this era. In a world in which people talk about alternative facts, you know, honest fact-based analysis, I think is more significant than ever. We're a global institution, you know, with 6 centers around the world. We try hard not to see every problem just through the prism of American foreign policy. We're an independent institution, which is increasingly rare in Washington in the sense that we're not beholden to, you know, a particular donor, a particular political party, a particular national point of view. That's something we really need to cling to. Having impact is a complicated thing, but you can't measure it just in terms of access to the executive branch of a particular administration. You know, you can measure it in terms of wider access in the Congress, for example, how you help to shape debate on important issues, how you help broaden our national reach, because, you know, we've been as guilty at Carnegie as I was in the State Department of the kind of conceit in the Washington establishment. We spend way too much time talking to each other. And, you know, I was out giving a speech, I think, in Omaha a month or so ago and used the term liberal international order. And people looked at me like I had 3 heads. But, you know, we have these kind of incantations. And I know John Eichenbrief's here. I don't mean, but no, I'm a huge admirer of what that order has brought and the importance of its adaptation. But my only point is we need to figure out better ways to connect with American citizens. I mean, that ought to be one of the lessons of, you know, our last election cycle as well. It's one thing to be dismissive of, you know, our current president and his policies. It's a mistake, it seems to me, to be dismissive of the angst that a lot of people feel in this country for whom it's not self-evident, you know, that America ought to be the indispensable power, that American leadership is the answer to all problems. You can convince a lot of people of the connection between middle-class interests in this country and a disciplined engagement overseas, but it takes work. And that's another of the areas where I hope at Carnegie we can, you know, add some contribution and some value over the few years. Sure. Hi.
Hi. So my question has something to do with that metaphor you used of digging the hole.
Yeah,
So Secretary Tillerson has changed the structure of the State Department quite a bit. And additionally, the President of the United States, on a very regular basis, seems to sometimes validate the paranoia of various hostile foreign powers or other groups that may want to do the United States harm. And I'm just wondering, given that it's plausible that we could continue digging this metaphorical hole through 2025, what do you think is now salvageable and what might not be?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I'll start with the optimistic. I'm a big believer in the resilience of the United States. I think, as I was saying in my opening remarks, part of the problem is that this kind of detachment or hole digging on the part of the United States comes at a time when the rest of the international landscape is not standing still. You know, it's when you have to deal with rising powers, with, you know, shifting architecture and lots of other things too. So there's an opportunity cost there that can be pretty significant. And so that's one kind of cost. There's an institutional cost too. I mean, you know, the State Department is made up of people, and so you can attract good people, more good people, in addition to the ones that are already there to the State Department. You can repair some of the damage that's been done. But some of the corrosion, I fear, is going to become permanent in the sense that you have, you know, you're beginning to have a generation of foreign diplomats who are pretty cold-blooded in their view of things. And, you know, if they can't get answers from people in the State Department, they're going to look elsewhere, and you build a pattern then. You build a pattern, which I hope isn't the case of the students in this room, but of people who, get turned off from public service or turned off from diplomatic service, which I think would be deeply unfortunate. And it takes a while to recover from that. Even in the second half of the 1990s, after the Cold War, there was this big, Jesse Helms-induced push to cut costs. State Department was one of the victims of that. We had almost no intake into the Foreign Service for about 4 years in the second half of the 90s. So when I'd go around to see Ryan in one of the embassies he ran overseas and say, well, I'd like to meet the mid-level officers here, there'd be nobody there. There are a lot of very junior officers, a lot of very senior ones. But for any institution, that does real damage that takes time to fix. And this all comes against the backdrop of a time when we've suffered since 9/11 to some extent from the inversion of the roles of force and diplomacy. In some ways, the understandable fixation on terrorism and the threat that it posed to us, the military in some respects became our tool of first resort. That's a role that ought to be played by diplomacy. And so, we're trying to undo that pattern and at the same time hollowing out an institution. And so anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying that I fear that some of the damage is going to be really hard to undo.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sure.
That was actually one of my 2 questions, so thank you for asking it. My follow-on question to that in terms of how deep that hole goes and how long it takes to rebuild. You had mentioned that there are a lot of missing appointments at the senior levels of the Department of State, and being a hierarchical organization, it's hard for decisions to be made if there aren't those people at the top to make those
Yes.
decisions. I'm wondering what your advice would be to young students like ourselves who might be
Yeah.
looking at careers in the civil or foreign service in this current environment, and what your advice would be, whether we should still plan on going into those careers now in the environment,
Yeah.
or should it be smart to wait? Or?
Well, no, it's a really good question. I mean, given the pace at which, appointments to the Foreign Service move, actually you're pretty safe now because it'll be 2 years before you get in anyway, or the civil service for that matter too. I can understand the hesitations that, a lot of students might have right now. And certainly there are a lot of different avenues into public service or into international service in general. That sometimes can lead back to the Foreign Service or civil service in the State Department too. So I continue to strongly encourage people to take advantage of those opportunities. I actually think that whenever that moment of rebuilding comes, when we stop digging, I think it's actually a hugely exciting moment to try to rebuild an institution, to try to rebuild America's image in the world, to try to rebuild a sense of respect for what we're about, and try to rebuild the habit of, the diplomatic profession of what we do, which is to organize, to mobilize coalitions of countries, whether it's in dealing with an earthquake in Pakistan or the Ebola crisis or Desert Storm in 1990-91. That's what we do and ought to do as well or better than anyone else. And that can be a really exciting moment, I think, for people to enter a profession as well. What I feel worst for in some sense are people at more senior levels, some of our former colleagues, because, then you're inevitably in a position where you have to defend what oftentimes seems like the indefensible. Excuse my language, but, if you're an ambassador in an African country and you get to explain the distinction between shithole and shithouse, that's not what people sign up to be American diplomats to do. But for more junior officers, there are huge opportunities out there to broaden your skills and to, build the kind of foundation that's going to make you a much more effective foreign policy professional in the years ahead. So, sure.
Are we out of questions here?
No, one gentleman right here. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for the thought-provoking lecture.
Sure.
Trump administration's position on most of the world affairs is not necessarily the median position of US citizens. That, coupled with the diplomatic degeneration that you just mentioned,
Yes.
has produced a vacuum. Now, how much of this inertia will fall as a burden to Trump's successor. And do you think that is recoverable, whether it is Republican or Democratic?
Yeah.
What is the successor facing? Is it something that we can recover from?
Well, I mean, I think you can recover from a lot of it. I think it's, yeah, it's a burden in some respects, but it's also an opportunity. You know, as I was saying at the outset of my remarks, there are a lot of enduring strengths that come with being the United States today. And what we need to do is better draw on them. And so there's no reason that we can't sustain a position of preeminence, which means we're going to have to adapt a lot of our behavior on the international landscape. We're not in a position to dictate events, even if we once imagined that we were. But I think it's a significant opportunity for the United States, too, to rebuild that sense of respect for the United States and respect for diplomacy in particular. So that's the optimistic part of me anyways. Ma'am, I'm sorry, excuse me. The lights.
Sorry, I can't get out to a
That's
mic.
okay.
I'm just wondering if we have ever any hope of getting out of Afghanistan. Have you got any thoughts about that?
I don't know if you could all hear the question, any hope of getting out of Afghanistan, and I'm standing up here alongside a former ambassador to Afghanistan who's, you know, devoted more to that issue than most anybody I know. I don't have a neat answer to that question, to be honest with you. I worry that, you know, we continue to, you know, try to offer the same answers to old problems that we haven't been able to solve before. I think it was a mistake for us to have invested so much a few years ago in the notion of kind of nation building in Afghanistan, not because I think that Afghans themselves don't deserve that, to build stronger national institutions, but simply because I think it's beyond the capacity of the United States to do that. I've always thought that our aims in Afghanistan ought to have been fairly minimal, you know, after 9/11. It was, in its essence, it was to ensure that that country could never again be used as a platform for the export of violent extremism or attacks on the United States. And I can't imagine that we're going to be able to sustain the long-term, you know, military presence in Afghanistan that we've now sustained for 17 years. And I just, what I fear, to be honest with you, in this administration is that the president was clearly quite reluctant when he agreed to the, you know, relatively small surge in U.S. military personnel last year. And I fear you could see a lurch, you know, from one position to another as well. And I don't think that's going to do us any favors either. So it's just hard for me to see how we can sustain that for a whole lot longer. You know, part of the answer lies, I think, self-evidently in working more closely with other regional players, but that comes right back to the question about Pakistan, which is a lot easier said than done. And you got a lot of regional players that are, you know, tactically trying to take advantage right now and aren't necessarily much interested in the best interests of Afghans themselves. And I think that's another of the costs that we pay for relative American detachment diplomatically, is that whatever capacity we had to mobilize those countries to try to focus on what it would take to help create a little bit more chance for stability in Afghanistan, we're also gradually walking away from right now. Yes. Oops, sorry. Oh, hi. I'm sorry.
Hi. Thank you very much for your sharing your thoughts. My question is on the rationale for the North Korea to be pursuing the nuclear arsenal, especially your take on it, because I've heard so many theories about that regarding the insurance against regime change to, you know, like getting ready for the asymmetric warfare. Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, North Korea is as much a mystery to me as it is for most people. I mean, I think regime survival is at the core of Kim Jong-un's interest in perfecting the capacity to deliver a nuclear weapon, potentially, the continental United States. I think it's very hard for him to see pursuit of that capacity as, you know, he sees that as indistinguishable from the survival and the reason to be of his own regime. There are those who believe that there's a longer term objective there. In other words, that He wants to use that capacity, the North Korean leadership does, to better drive wedges between the United States and South Korea, and ultimately to expand North Korean influence on the peninsula. I don't know the answer to that question. It's certainly plausible over time, but I think the answer to that has a lot to do with investing in the health of South Korea, which is an infinitely more successful society and country than North Korea as well. So any way you look at it, I think it's very much in the interests of the United States to do everything we can to limit that capacity. It's just, I think we have to be pretty cold-eyed about ends and means, and what risks we're prepared to take to accomplish the end of denuclearization. I suspect that containment and deterrence is going to wind up being the least bad alternative before us. And I say that without any great satisfaction, because containing and deterring the Soviet Union was one thing, containing and deterring a regime which is in some ways more mercurial and more difficult to predict is another. Although I'm not one of those people who believes that Kim Jong-un is crazy or irrational. I mean, look at the way he's played the diplomacy and the politics of the Winter Olympics. That's actually pretty clever. And so he's trying to buy time while he continues to develop the capacity that I mentioned before. But people's conclusion on that issue of what the ultimate aim of the North Korean nuclear and missile program is a significant question, because if you conclude that he's bent on reunification of the Korean peninsula through North Korean force, through intimidation, then it feeds the argument of some in Washington that we're going to have to act sooner or later. We might as well act now while we have relatively more leverage. I think that would be a very reckless thing to do, but I can see how that logic gets fed. Hi.
Hi, you mentioned 9/11, so I wanted to ask a question about the American relationship with Saudi Arabia in the post 9/11 world, and if you can speak a little bit from your experience of what leverage the United States has with Saudi Arabia, and what kind of the long-term plans are with that relationship, and if you foresee the Americans being able to make any changes in Saudi Arabia.
It's one of the more complicated relationships that the United States has had in recent years. I think, as I was trying to suggest before, that we need to distinguish between different of the apparent ambitions of Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi leadership. I think his efforts at social and economic modernization are ones that we ought to support wholeheartedly. Whether that's rights of women, whether or not that's the possibility of opening up the economy and trying to move off an almost total dependence on hydrocarbons. That's a lot easier said than done. It probably should have been started a decade or two ago. But those are things that the United States, it seems to me, ought to support. But as I was trying to suggest, we need to try to build a two-way street into that relationship too, that while we'll provide wholehearted support for that, while we'll have Saudi Arabia's back as a partner in the face of at least potential external threats from Iran or anyone else, that we have to be honest, as friends should be, about catastrophes like Yemen, in which Saudi Arabia is spending billions and billions of dollars, and I think alienating the next generation of Yemenis. And of course the Iranians are supporting the Houthi rebellion, but it's not costing them very much. They didn't invent it. And from their point of view, it's diverting the Saudis from places where they could be using their influence, whether it's in Syria or other parts of the region too. So I just think you want to build maybe a little bit more honesty into the relationship, and I think there's a danger in being a little bit too indulgent sometimes too. I know Saudis have their own gripes about the United States, and particularly policy in the last administration after the Iranian nuclear agreement. I've certainly heard that enough myself. But I think a healthy relationship is going to be one which is a two-way street and is honest about those issues. Yes, sir.
Thank you. One of the things that I understand that is a bug to Putin has been the expansion of NATO almost entirely around Russia. So my question is, do you think the expansion of NATO in that way was a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's a very good question. I think my own view is you got to distinguish between different phases of that. I was ambivalent about, the first phase of expansion in NATO. I was serving in Moscow then, so maybe that colored my view. But, when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia were taken in at that time. So ambivalent, I wasn't opposed. I just, was mindful of the downsides in terms of how a Russia, not the weakened Russia that we were dealing with in the mid-90s, but a Russia down the road would react. On the other hand, you can see I'm like a recovering diplomat with on the one hand, on the other hand. On the other hand, if I were a Pole or a Hungarian, I would understand the value of trying to anchor yourself in a Western security system. Where I think we made a mistake, to be honest with you, is later on, in the spring of 2008, when the United States pushed hard to open a pathway for membership for Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. Ukraine is always going to be the brightest of red lines for any Russian leadership, whether it's Putin or anyone else. And this was at a time when it was clear there was no consensus within the alliance. The Germans and the French were quite opposed to moving ahead in a serious way toward membership. And I just think, I think that was unnecessary, and I think it fed Putin's narrative, however flawed it might be in many respects, that the sole purpose of the United States was to keep Russia down, to limit its capacity to play a more influential role in the world, and in particular to undermine him. That's wrong. I think that's a flawed set of assumptions, but I think that spring of 2008, I think we fed that, which, you can't draw a straight line between that and the Georgia war in August of 2008 or what happened in Ukraine 3 or 4 years ago. But, it fed that sense of, Russians being taken advantage of, and, that sense on Putin's part that you're not going to kick sand in our face anymore.
You get the last word.
Yes. Thank you very much. My question is about the return of Syrian refugees,
Yes.
the condition and timing under which you would see this happening, and then assuming that the dynamics we're seeing in Syria continue in the future, how interactions between Sunni Syrian refugees and Shia militias from Iran would play out in the future?
I think it's, as you know as well as I do, I think it's going to be a deeply unsettled situation for a while. I think, today, 20% of the population of Lebanon, 25% of the population of Jordan are Syrian refugees. I think my guess is that many of them are going to be there for a long time. In northern Jordan, for example, where you have, a huge number of Syrian refugees, 80% of whom are not living in camps, but living in Jordanian communities. It's just difficult for me to see that, the security circumstances are going to change fast enough to allow for any kind of rapid return. Lebanon's always a little bit different situation, but there too, I think it's going to be a while. And then every time you see a story of a, Shia militia group backed by the Iranians or somebody else, fomenting attacks or something else that's going to discourage people from returning. So, it may be possible it'll be localized. It'll depend on particular parts of Syria, whether people have a sense through family connections or anything else that they can go back. But I think it's going to be a while before there's a large-scale return. I hate to say that from the human point of view of Syrians, but also in terms of the capacity of neighboring states to continue to sustain this, which I think is already pretty strained. Sure.
Well, thank you, Bill.
My pleasure.